Hello, everybody. This is Joshua Hatton with One Nation Under Whiskey podcast. I'm joined today, and I'm joined as always by my good friend, my business partner, the wonderful Jason Johnston Yellen. Hi, Jason.
Hello, Joshua Hatton.
Yeah.
Well,
as I was saying
flawless,
that,
pro. Let's cut out this drivel.
As I was saying that, you looked to be. Well, you sort of looked as if you were bracing yourself.
Yes, I was.
You were guarding your
Did
loins.
You see me applying the aircraft seatbelt that I have on this office chair? I've had that installed ever since I was called nefarious in an introduction.
Yeah. Well, no, I didn't have anything in the hopper. I just wanted to call you wonderful.
Just call me often. But we did have the joy of one another's company in person this very week. So it feels a little different coming to our FaceTime recording, where normally this is the only way I see your face. And yet this week, I saw you in person in Chicago. And I saw a ton of other wonderful people along with you.
So now I know what you were bracing for. So for our listeners' sake, we recorded a live podcast at Warehouse Liquors. We were celebrating our 10th/11th Single Cast Nation anniversary, and so we got to the top floor in Warehouse. We set everything up. We tested the mics. We tested the speakers. People started coming in. Pizza came in. Bottles are ready. Everybody's seated. And I get to the point where I'm saying, hello, everybody. This is Joshua Hatton with One Nation Under Whiskey. And I could not remember how the intro went. So were you seeing how I would trip it up this time?
No, I'm still reeling from being called nefarious in an introduction.
I'll keep that in mind. I may have some other naughty words.
It was hilarious, though, at Warehouse Liquors when you turned to me at the start of the introduction and said, I don't know what comes next.
I don't, right? It's like going out into public and you see someone out of context. Kind of like what you're talking about just now, right? Where normally I see you over FaceTime on my computer or my phone. And, you see someone out of context and you don't know how to conduct yourself. And that's exactly what happened.
Well, it's also kind of the same when we do the live podcast, and that was the first one we'd done in officially 2 years, just over 2 years. And there's a way you and I speak to one another here when we're just simply recording this. Yes, we're thinking about our dear listeners scattered around the globe and the fact that they will ultimately listen to a final version of this. But when the people are eyeballing you from 6 feet away, it's a lot. And I love seeing the people. But at the same time, we're running a tasting and we're talking to each other. Yeah. And we're taking questions from Charlie, who runs Drammers and does a fantastic job of it. And he did a fantastic job of the questions he was asking as well. And I'm thinking about, okay, how is this landing with people? And then for those in the back, are they making enough noise that this is going to get picked up on the microphones? Or is this just going to present ambient sound to the live pod? Like, I'm racing through 100 different thoughts. And when you and I are just sitting like this over FaceTime, having a chat, that all I'm thinking about is the chat that you and I are having.
Yeah, exactly. As it is now. And, one of the luxuries of recording the way that we do now and have really since the beginning, because we've never lived close to one another, is we can have the conversation and I can bleep out, every time you say, I'm just like bleep, and you say, and then you say, and then you say, and I bleep all of that out. And then, there really is a luxury simply to going back to the conversation. And there are things that you say or I say, right? And we say, listen back to it. And if it sounds like the joke isn't going to hit, then edit it out. And there were a few times during the live event where I said some things that didn't hit. And I remember talking about it afterwards in a car with Elijah. And I said, geez, I said X. I don't even remember what it was. And he said, don't you edit that out. That was a good joke.
It'll be the one moment in the live podcast where you play canned laughter and the dear listeners will not notice at all. They're very generous. They're very generous listeners.
It'll be the loudest laugh on the entire recording.
But it's interesting. I was just listening, and this was a re-listen to something that came out, last summer or a couple of summers ago, where Mike Birbiglia, who we've talked about enough times on this podcast, was talking to Jim Gaffigan on his podcast, on Mike Birbiglia's podcast. And there's a point where Jim Gaffigan says, you can't help but edit yourself in front of an audience.
Yeah.
And Jim Gaffigan says, I have enough of my own jokes in my arsenal that I can pivot depending on how a crowd is receiving me. And he gave an example of doing a show the night before the recording, and he knew within one joke that they weren't there to hear anything about, say, religion.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
And in his mind, he just edited out all the jokes he was about to present on religion and just cut to another set of jokes.
Amazing.
And I think that's one of the complicating factors when you and I do a live podcast is we are getting that immediate feedback.
Yes.
Normally our feedback is you to me and me to you.
It's a loop.
And then like you're saying, there's editing software where we can say, yeah, that just didn't work. Between you and me, that wasn't successful. And so that, or something that does get left in, if that doesn't resonate with any of our listeners, we don't see their faces. We don't know that it failed.
Yeah. Oh, that's a good point. Yeah.
Whereas in the room, when we're back to eyeballing people, it's like, oof, that was something. Which actually makes me think how many Zoom tastings, and I know our dear listeners are the type of people to participate in these as well, and probably host some of their own, where in a Zoom, not everybody has their camera turned on. And so I would have 3 or 4 or 5 or 6 people in a Zoom, and I would watch them continually.
Yes.
And they were my feedback loop. And I would think, is this resonating? Is this an interesting point that I'm making? Are they nodding their heads? Are they nodding asleep? Are they just resting their eyes? Are they shaking their heads vigorously? Do they look angry? Right? Like just to use those 3 or 4 or 5 or 6 people to gauge a 20-person tasting, a 40-person tasting, a what have you. And so again, live in the room, that's what we're doing. That's who we're looking for. Is who's this working for and who's this not working for? Yeah. And do I value one over the other?
Yeah, it's interesting. It's an interesting point that you bring up about the Zoom, right? Because we'll have a Zoom tasting, and I think you set it up and you can see 24 people per page, right? Mm-hmm. And
25, not including yourself.
Yeah, correct. And invariably, like you said, you have people that just shut off their screen, but everybody's on mute, which I think is a good thing. But I also think it's a bad thing too, right? Because it gives the people the ability to just dip in and out of things and just have conversations, side conversations, and not be fully engaged. And back to your example about Jim Gaffigan and Mike Birbiglia, both of them, Haida and I, over the pandemic, watched some of their online stand-up shows, or what was Birbiglia's Working It Out, or that's his podcast, but he would work out jokes.
I feel like one of his shows was Working Out. One of them was pizza for a cause or something like that. So he had a whole bunch of names for his different Zoom things. But yeah, we both attended them.
But what I liked about how those were set up is everybody was encouraged to keep their microphones on, but have it down to like 25% volume or something like that, just so the comedians could hear the feedback, right? Because imagine being a comedian and telling a joke and just having screens off or, whatever. You just don't get that. You're not receiving back the laughs that you're trying to pull out of these people, and that's going to affect your performance. And I would argue that some of these Zoom tastings that not just we do, but that anybody does, I think it may not be such a bad thing to do something similar like that just to keep people engaged, because I think we could and should get a bit more engagement from these Zoom events. As Zoom tastings went on, at first everybody was engaged. Like, oh my gosh, look at those humans on my screen. Oh my gosh, there are other people.
I'm not staring at my family for an hour and a half. This is amazing.
But then as time went on, they were still doing it because it was a reason to try new whiskey, try a new whatever. But interest would wane. And yeah, so I've thought about that a couple of times,
Do you remember the Zoom that you and I did together, and there was a participant in his swimming pool?
I do remember that.
And he had the drams lined up on the side of his pool, and then in any kind of down moment he would just kind of push off and just wade back into the water and then just do a slow crawl back to the side for another dram. That was perhaps... Now I'm really racking my brain. I'm making a Joshua-style list here. That was perhaps one of the wackier participants I saw in Zoom land during the pandemic tastings.
Look at you making a declarative statement that you always warn me against.
I did say one of. I've left that top spot to have some company.
I tell you,
I'm just waiting on you saying, but don't you remember when this happened? Right. And then I'll say, oh, yeah, that was definitely the wackiest.
Well, in the live recording, we were talking about whiskey ages, right? And this comes up all the time in a tasting where, we'll often lead a tasting with a 25-year-old, a 40-year-old, something that's older and softer because it is a softer whiskey. And then we will end with a younger whiskey, right? Because the vibrancy of flavor just changes. And we were talking about the Catoctin Creek 2-year-old, and I made a very declarative statement. I said...
I thought about this on my own plane ride home from Chicago.
I said, I think that may be the best rye we ever bottled. And I said that without thinking. Now, I think it is...
Classic Joshua.
It is absolutely remarkable, and I think what I should have said is it is perhaps one of the more unique ryes that we've bottled.
There's that word.
One of them, right? I'm not setting it atop. I'm putting it within a grouping. But I come up with this sort of not augmented, modified statement because on my plane ride home, I was just going back mentally through our archives and thinking, well, there was that 8-year-old MGP that was just floored me. And then there were the Whistle Pigs, right? And then we have this Backwoods coming out. And
see, welcome to what goes through my head when you're making declarative statements. Welcome to the inner workings of Jason Three Names.
Oh my gosh.
It's interesting, though, that you say it was the Catoctin Creek 2-year-old. I thought on the night, and I put up my hand, I could have easily misheard you here. I thought you were saying the Catoctin Creek 3-year-old finished in the Kilchoman was the best rye we've put out, not the 2-year-old. So,
the Catoctin Creek that we put in Kilchoman was a 4-year-old. There was a Catoctin Creek 3-year-old that we put in... What kind of cask was it? Was that a white wine cask? A sister to the 2-year-old?
for the full maturation, and then it was finished in new charred oak.
Finished in new charred, so we could officially call it a rye whiskey, right?
Correct.
And then there was the 2-year-old, which was similar.
15 and 15, 15 and 16.
Yes,
it was a split between new char and refill.
Yeah, no.
Refill wine.
No, I think the 4-year-old was perhaps the most balanced Catoctin Creek we had done. Simply because there were new elements brought in that seemed to balance everything out, right? Like the bright spice from the Catoctin Creek, I think, balanced out some of the sweetness from the sherry, and the sweetness from the sherry kind of balanced out some of the peat from the Kiln that was previously in that wood. So I would say that was probably the most balanced. But so if we're about to make a declarative statement, in the scope of our 3 Catoctin Creeks, the 2, 3, and the 4, for my palate, I would say that 2-year-old was my favorite.
Interesting.
Do you disagree? Do you have a different take on it?
Only because I wouldn't make a declarative statement. I wouldn't say it was my favorite.
You make declarative statements all the time. Why do
I'm
you
making
refuse?
a declarative statement about not making declarative statements. Here's something else I want to quickly talk about before we go over to our friends at Woodinville here.
Go ahead.
And this will actually be, I think, a nice transition.
Go ahead.
And it goes from what we're talking about here about a favourite and a distillery and what have you.
I'm your favorite?
Also, I clearly did not declare that. Also this week, we launched our first single cask from the Virginia Distillery Company.
Yeah, we did.
And it's this 5-year-old American single malt, all 5 years in Spanish oak, that had formerly held Oloroso and then Pedro Jimenez before coming to America to hold Virginia Distillery Company New Make. There's a lot going on there, right? And we've been tasting it. We've been pimping it. You and I are thoroughly in love with it. Thoroughly. Mm-hmm. And we launched it to the nation. And the nation had our tasting video, our tasting notes, mm-hmm. and our podcast episode with Amanda Beckwith to go from.
Yep.
And we sold more than a hoggie's worth of that release.
Yes.
And we had a but. The reason we had a but is A, that's the sample that we fell in love with. And B, we've been trying to get to a point where we can actually have some bottles on the website so that people aren't...
Just to clarify for our listeners, when you said we had a but, I just want to make sure they understand that's the cask size you're talking about, right? Because I just want to make sure people understand.
Butts worth?
A butts worth.
Not just an unofficial shitload. A butts worth.
Exactly.
We actually had a Spanish oak butt of this liquid.
Oak sherry butt, 500 liter. There you go. Yes.
Yeah. I think a butt worth. I don't use that language loosely or easily, Joshua. It's only when it applies to a size.
Okay.
Often large. So, and so I'm just hugely impressed that we have a nation who would trust us, trust our palate, trust a new distillery coming into the spirit of collaboration fold. And it's really interesting. And unlike you, I'm not going to attach a number to this, but we saw a high percentage of single bottle orders.
Yes.
Where we know for the nation, one part of that is the sharing of the wealth. Right? Nation members want as many other nation members to get their hands on a bottle, give it a taste.
Yeah, good on them.
The other part of this is get that bottle, bring it in, give it a taste, right? Move beyond our tasting video, our tasting notes, and our podcast episode with Amanda Beckwith. Make up your own mind. And now, by having a butt available, we can have nation members return to it and make another order. And one of the things that struck me about this week and about this offering is when it comes to single cask nation, we're deeply committed to putting out good whiskey. And just like you went through this a second ago with the Catoctin Creek, right? There's some rye going out. We did some MGP. We've done some light whiskey from them. We've put out American single malt from Westland. Obviously Scotch, obviously rum, obviously other things. But it's about good whiskey. And one of the things that resonates in this conversation with Orlin and Brett is that they got into this to make good whiskey. And there are a few moments in our interview where we try to kind of volley around the use of craft and craft distillery and craft spirits. And they kept volleying it back with good whiskey, good whiskey, good whiskey, and what makes good whiskey. And I felt in this conversation where we were meeting Orlin and Brett for the very first time, I felt like we had commonality in our visions. And I just thought that this week, with our Virginia Distillery Company release and getting ready to talk about Woodinville, I just thought it dovetailed so beautifully around the idea, the issue, the focus on good whiskey.
Really quickly, back to your point about craft. You're right. We brought that up, and you'd even, and the listeners will hear it, you'd even asked a question about the use of the word craft and the fact that it had been used in a pejorative manner. And I can't remember if it was Orlin or if it was Brett, but he said, if you look at our bottle, because you would ask them, do you use that? You know, is that a word that you like to use, or do you try to dodge it? And he said, well, if you look at our bottle, it says real craft, which I thought was interesting, right? It's taking a word and it's saying, no, this is real craft. It was there's right, and all I did was repeat those two words back to you, but it's the emphasis, right? It's the real craft, right? Which it feels like it's saying something more. And then when you go back and you taste the whiskey, I would argue, if we're living here in the world of bourbon, I would argue that Eddie and Jimmy, they're craftsmen. They're making a wonderful, right? Our friends,
exactly.
Yeah, exactly. Our friends at Maker's Mark, our friends all around, all the distilleries that we know and we work with, those are true craftspeople making a craft product. It is unfortunate that the word craft is used in the negative, similar to Scotch whiskey, where the word blend is used as a negative statement. Meanwhile, they can and sometimes are better. They can be and often are better than some single malts, because it's about the artistry of blending that product together. It's the artistry of crafting a delicious whiskey. So yeah, I really enjoyed that bit of the conversation.
Yeah, no, I thought it was a cracking conversation. I took to them really quickly. I bought into their vision really quickly, and their passion, and their enthusiasm. I think our listeners' declarative statement will have the same experience as us.
So Brett, Orlin, thank you both so much for joining us. My first experience with Woodinville, I want to say, dates back to either 2016 or 2017. My guess is it may be 2017. We ran the Whiskey Jubilee Festival, which was New York, Chicago, and Seattle. And Woodinville joined us, I think it was 2017. And now Jason would always run the Single Cask Nation table, and I would be the one going around just making sure everybody has what everybody needs and so on. And I remember going to your table and tasting your bourbons and being floored by its deliciousness. I'm not going to lie to you. I approached the table with a mentality of, is this going to be, how should I say this? There's a lot of great whiskey being made throughout the U.S., and there's a lot of craft producers that I don't think the quality has caught up with the amount of production in some producers. And I was nervous, but when I tasted it, I said, man, this is just an expertly made bourbon that I can sip on day in, day out. And then I want to say, just the next year, we heard that Glenmorangie, or the parent company of Glenmorangie, Louis Vuitton Moet Hennessy, had purchased you guys. So it was clear you were on to something. And so I've got to ask, bourbon in Seattle. Let's talk about that. Is Woodinville the first bourbon producer in Seattle? Where did this start from? Where did this idea come from?
Well, that's a long question to answer, probably for Brett and I. If we date back to, kind of this started with two best friends and a dream, and then how we got to the product that you were tasting, 6 or 7 years later. But that's really how it did begin. We just, Brett and I have known each other for almost 30 years, went to high school and college together. And then, as we started our careers, would always come together with a glass of whiskey on Friday night and talk about our lives and, and potentially our dreams for the future. And it was always that conversation. Wouldn't it be great if we could do something together that we loved, that, would provide enough income for us to support our families. And here in the Pacific Northwest, we're very familiar with, especially Woodinville. There's 100 craft wineries here. And so we had grown up right here and seen this craft wine boom and beer. We're very familiar. So when the spirits opportunity arose, it was not foreign to either of us. And basically, we were both looking at it. Brett was kind of researching it when it started in 2009 here in Washington State. The laws had changed, and I was doing the same. And we kind of just had that night together. Hey, have you heard about this craft distillery boom that's going on and the laws that are changing? And really, that's when it started. And we did all the due diligence and research on what it took. But a lot happened between then and 2017 to actually get the quality of the liquid that, we wanted, what we were striving to from day one. And I'll kind of let Brett, talk about, our mentors in the production process, once we were up and going.
Yeah. So obviously in the beginning we had this dream that we wanted to make bourbon specifically. Obviously back in the day there was nothing on the internet on how to make bourbon. And if you think about it, back then there was 7 or 8 large producers in Kentucky that made almost all the world's bourbon. And it wasn't really being made in a craft environment at the time. Maybe there were some small producers around the country tinkering with it. But if you think about it, most of those secrets of how to make bourbon have been passed down from the generations of master distillers within these small amount of companies in Kentucky. And so we knew it was critical in the beginning to find a mentor to teach us how to properly make it from day one. And in a roundabout way, we had heard that our mentor, Dave Pickerell, had retired from Maker's Mark, and he'd been there for 14 and a half years. And he was starting to do some consulting work. Orlin stalked Dave down, and the long and the short of it is we finally convinced Dave to be our consultant and mentor and teach us how to make bourbon the correct way from day one. And so literally Dave was there the first day we were doing a mash. And,
Oh, wow. Okay.
So, we were an open slate. We didn't have any bad habits to break. So we were just trying to absorb as much information from our teacher, Dave, as possible. And we had millions of questions, and I don't think there was ever a question that Dave didn't have an answer for. I don't know if you guys ever met Dave, but
Yep.
The guy could spin a yarn, he could tell a tale, and half the time you didn't know if he was telling the truth or if this was actually something that Dave was just making up. But Dave was an incredible man, and he taught us everything we know and taught us all the building blocks to making a quality whiskey from the start. It starts with your grain selection and your mashing process, and then your fermentation process needs to be dialed in, and then you get to the distills and how to properly distill this product to have the flavor in the white spirit that's going to compete with the barrel over the years of aging and turn into a magnificent product after the barrel aging process. So he held our hand along the way. We're lucky when we got him because he wasn't that busy in the beginning of his consulting. So he spent many, many, many months in Woodinville holding our hand and teaching us all the processes. So that's kind of how we got our start. And, when you're making whiskey, as you guys know, what you make, you don't know for years down the line if it actually is going to turn out well. So having that guiding hand with us in the beginning to reassure us, we've never distilled whiskey before. We didn't know, off the still, when you're tasting White Dog, how would you know this is going to turn into a beautiful product years down the road? And so having that confidence of Dave when he's tasting the White Dog coming off the still, teaching us how to make the proper heads, hearts, and tails cuts, just being the guiding hand along the process and teaching us what we're looking for and how to make this properly was huge in the beginning.
So what were the pillars? Like when he's setting you guys up and getting you to produce a new make spirit or a White Dog that he felt after years in a barrel would turn into a beautiful and delicious product. What were the foundational pillars that you had to adhere to ensure that?
Funny you asked that because, as new young distillers, we had gone to, different apprenticeships and, learning and doing all these workshops and you're taught a lot of different things. And basically what it came down to for us is new make off the still can taste pretty good if you distill it in a higher proof fashion, clean it up a little bit. But that spirit also lacks a lot of the character, depth, and complexity that is needed, after years and years in a barrel. And so we fought that really in our younger careers with Dave. It's like, man, we're kind of going out on a limb here with this White Dog. It's full of flavor, that's for sure. But and that's when the White Dog. So we were actually bottling White Dog. If you guys remember, about 10 years ago, everybody was bottling their White Dog and selling their White Dog. And so it was this dichotomy for us of what goes in the barrel versus what goes in the bottle as a White Dog. But Dave gave a lot of. He was really big on if we're getting technical, a lot of sensory of just smelling. Like he was really big, hands on the White Dog and smelling, and he could really. He really taught us on what we were looking for from character to do we have where our tails cuts are being made. Do we have enough of is our distillation proof low enough that we're getting the character through, but not so high that we're removing things that we don't want to remove. So ultimately, it was just kind of best practices that that he had learned over his 30-year career and handed down to us. And then over the years, we were able to definitely refine that, especially as we saw the whiskey, tasted the whiskey maturing and how it was progressing. Kind of come into our own on that and be able to refine the products from there.
So
I like what you were.
Go ahead.
Sorry, go on, Brett.
I was just going to say, obviously in the beginning, Dave came from makers, so wheat was their flavoring grain and that. So he told us in the beginning, he goes, I have Maker's exact mash bill. We can do that and we can try it. But he goes, you'll never out Maker's. That's Maker's. So we wanted to try Maker's mash bill in the beginning. So we did a wheated bourbon. And then obviously Dave was very passionate about rye, as we all know. So he really pushed us to use rye as a flavoring grain. So we did a side-by-side comparison, tasted the distillates, and Orlin and I really gravitated towards the rye spice. We really liked that over the wheat as our flavoring grain. Yeah. So we made a decision very early on to focus our bourbon mash bill on corn, rye, and malted barley. So that was pretty clear in the very, very beginning.
Okay.
That was actually the answer to the question I was going to pose to you. I liked what you'd said earlier about coming to Dave as a blank slate and you had no bad habits to undo. But I was curious where you imprinted your DNA upon Woodinville whiskey. And so this sense of going through a mash bill and saying, yeah, you could do this high wheat bourbon along the way, but here's really what we want to be in this. My other part of that then is when you started, and obviously there's this sense of keeping the lights on and keeping the doors open, you're selling White Dog. Were you also doing smaller barrels with an eye on going to larger barrels? Did you start from larger barrels? What did the wood side look like when you were busy selling White Dog to pay bills?
Yeah, two pieces. So, our DNA, there's a lot along the process that Brett and I feel that, we were working towards. Really a balanced bourbon was what we wanted. We didn't want something overpowering. We were using a high rye content, so that was going to take care of itself in the mash bill. And then from, as it matured, just being able to have every element that you would expect in a bourbon and not one overtaking the other. And we can talk a little bit about some of the things we do as we continue the conversation to ensure that. But forgive me, the second part of the question too, I had
on the wood side. The smaller barrels.
Yeah, so
early.
Yeah, so we had just a progression in our business model. Unfortunately, that's the challenge, Josh, as you talked about initially, is the expectations of craft whiskey, and that really comes down to like the financial dynamic and time. And we didn't start with deep pockets. Brett and I we really just invested everything that we had saved as working, throughout our young careers. And so we kind of had to be scrappy and do the things that we needed to do to support what we were trying to achieve without bastardizing the brand, if you will, and becoming a potpourri distillery and making rum and gin and all of these different products and sidetracking us. We were laser focused on flagship product, the bourbon and the rye that we produce now. So White Dog and an Age Your Own whiskey kit early on. We're thankfully the timing.
I remember those.
Yes, it was. That was a big key to us being able to support our operations. And then we went a small barreled line. We called it our micro barreled bourbon and micro barreled rye. It was very transparent about this is kind of the second step in our evolution. Aged for a year and a half, 2 years in small barrels, and really trying to engage the consumers with it's the same whiskey going in the barrel, but understand what the flavor differences are going to be. You're going to be much more wood forward in this, in for what it is. And then, absolutely, in our flagship products, our bourbon and rye, we spent a tremendous amount of time with Independent Stave. I say humbly, we help them develop their craft distillers line of bourbon barrels that they now offer. So all of the different options. We worked early on with an individual named Yuri De Leon. He was their wine guy, but a huge bourbon fan out of Napa. And so he engaged with us. We got to use some of their laboratory equipment and wood doctors, if you will, wood scientists. And we basically just said, hey, look, let's money aside, how do we make the best bourbon barrel? And, really outside of a couple distilleries that had played with that, obviously Buffalo Trace has done that over the years to a certain degree with a different wood, trying different types of wood treatments and species. Really just tried to put all our best practices forward. So, we seasoned, we did a bunch of testing, and we looked at it organoleptically as well as scientifically in a gas chromatograph to see what extracts we were getting, what flavor profiles we were getting in all of these different treatments, from a standard kiln dried barrel to a seasoned wood, seasoned for 18 months, seasoned for 24 months, different char levels, different toast levels, and really ended on what we've used since day one, which is an 18-month seasoned wood prior to building the barrel, a toasted head, a charred, obviously, body. We have to do that as well. And that creates all of the elements, really probably what attributes the most to the overall flavor profile in our matured product.
Did you then tweak the new make, the White Dog, along the way as you were moving from smaller barrels to larger barrels, or has that remained mostly where you started?
In the very beginning, when we decided we wanted the rye as our flavoring grain, we started adjusting the ratios of corn, rye, and barley very early on in our first year. And we settled early on our current mash bill that we've used from day one. So it's 72% corn, 22% rye, and 6% malt.
Yeah, I was going to say, distilling-wise, though, we didn't really change anything between the two different products, which is fascinating because if you taste the two side by side, I mean, you guys have done this enough, but you really can get to taste something that's aged in a small barrel and something that's aged for 5 to 6 years, like our flagship product, and just the difference between the two is it's a fun experiment.
Mm-hmm.
Well, in the small barrels, I mean, in barrel aging, you're getting extraction and oxidation. So with the small barrels, you're getting tons of extraction, but oxidation takes time, and there's not time in the small barrel to get the oxidation properties to fully integrate the whiskey and the wood together. So that's the difference in the micro barrels versus our standard 53-gallon barrels.
So, Jason, can I pop something in here?
Yeah. Okay. So, now the first time he said that, carry on. We haven't been on the road together in a while. Yeah, go on.
So what was 18-month air-dried staves doing for your barrels that a standard kiln-dried wood wasn't doing, or vice versa? What was the kiln-dried wood doing that you didn't want to be putting on your whiskey?
The 18th month seasoned wood, basically the wood breaks down, right? You have funguses and wind and snow and rain and all of the elements, because they just basically sit on pallets outside of the cooperage to season once the stage has been cut. And a simple way to put it is the whiskey is much more receptive. I guess things happen, I don't like to use faster, but more dramatically. And so when you compared, and this is not just organoleptic, this is my opinion of what the difference between a kiln-dried barrel and a seasoned wood barrel tastes like. This was actually done looking at some of the extracts, the vanillins, and seeing some of them in the seasoned wood were up to 50% higher at equivalent time frames. Year 3 and 4, we were seeing much more complexity and flavor in the in the seasoned wood.
So basically, what's happening in the seasoning process, like Orlin described, is you're getting these funguses growing. It's breaking the lignin down in the white oak. So it's already pre-breaking the lignin down that helps. Basically, the whiskey's extracting that into the barrel and breaking it down even further. So, we all know alcohol is a solvent. So versus a kiln-dried barrel, where the alcohol has to break that down from start versus the fungus has grown and pre-broke the lignin down on a seasoned barrel. That's kind of the difference. It doesn't accelerate the time, but I think it gets, like Dave called it, wood goody into the whiskey faster.
Wood goody.
Wood goody. That was a patented Dave Pickerel term.
Oh, that's fantastic.
I like that. I'm still in process here, which is one of the things that our listeners like hearing about and that not everybody really leads with. And honestly, I don't know if you guys want to talk about it in any depth either, but yeast. And you're talking about the fungus breaking down the wood, the lignin, and kind of, if not accelerating, maybe kickstarting the process when the spirit meets it. For yeast being that active component that gets you a product for distilling, have you done much in the way of yeast experimentation in the world of bourbon? Is it pretty straightforward? I'd love to hear more if possible. Early
on in the beginning, we experimented with a bunch of different yeasts out there, and we would obviously try the distillate and compare it. And, the yeast early on just didn't have the flavor profile we were looking for, so we kept experimenting with different yeasts until we found one that really had a robust flavor. And when tasting the White Dog off the still, that us and Dave really thought was going to stand up in the barrel and become a really wonderful product down the road.
We actually tried a champagne yeast, which was kind of fun just to see how that would play into the bourbon profile. It obviously is a very high producer of converting the starches into sugar, so you get a pretty high distiller's beer, high ABV distiller's beer. We tried various whiskey yeasts. Once you get into the American whiskey yeast category, there's not a lot of differential between from distillery to distiller. We're kind of all in the same family, with maybe slightly different genetics. So it's kind of what we found when we ultimately selected our final yeast that we've been using for 10, 11 years.
Were you finding, I know that's the term here in the United States is that distiller's beer, for me, a wash. But were you finding significant flavor differences in that stage as you're experimenting with different yeast?
Yeah, it's not really till off the still that we can really tell. Once we distill it, you can definitely see different, bricks and, different fermentation characteristics. But it's not until the distillation happens that, you're really tasting the final outcome of what that yeast is producing. Gotcha.
I'm going to rewind it even further. I like this. We're going through process forwards and backwards, right? We got the distillation, or a little bit of distillation, the maturation, then we went to yeast. I want to go back to the mashing part of it. And, our listeners are no stranger to this. A lot of our focus tends to be on malt whiskey, and then we will dip a toe in American whiskeys. So our frame of reference is always with malt. And when I think about mashing within the malt whiskey world, you have your option to go with once you're done with your mash, you have an option to transfer that wort or that sugary barley water into your wash packs clear, so you get fruitier components coming through when you pitch the yeast, or you can get a cloudy wort, and when you pitch the yeast, you get a nuttier style of wash or distiller's beer to then distill. And so my question for you is that part of the mashing process, that consideration of a clear wort or a cloudy one, or are you distilling with grains in too? Like, how does the mashing play into all of this?
Yeah, so we distill everything grain on. So the grain is in the process from mashing through fermentation and in the pot still. So the grain is always involved. We don't separate out the wort or the wash like a Scottish distillery or a malt distillery would. So that's how bourbon's always been made, grain in, and that's we continue doing it grain in. So in Kentucky, they talk a lot about the sour mash process.
Yeah,
we don't do a sour mash process. We do a sweet mash. So we're not using any back set to continue that sour mash process. Does that make sense?
Could you explain that just a little more for our listeners? Because I know we'll have gone through the sour mash, but a sweet mash is not something we hear about a lot, perhaps because people just aren't talking about it. But is the process similar, significantly different?
So, it's the sour mash process. It's been used, back in the day, they didn't have stainless fermentation tanks. They were using wood fermentation tanks. They didn't have the cleaning protocols that we have now to keep bacteria down. So the sour mash process is basically act as a pH buffer to basically protect the next fermentation from the bacteria and the bugs. So it's not really needed anymore. It's just done for tradition's sake, I believe. So the sweet mash basically it's a fresh mash every day. We're not reharvesting our yeast. We're using a fresh batch of yeast every day as well. So there's nothing carried over from the previous ferment or previous distillation run into the new mash.
Gotcha. Oh, that's lovely. That was a nice description, Brett. Cheers.
Thank you.
I wanted to move forward a little bit if we could. We've been talking mostly about bourbon, but I'm really curious to hear about your rye as well, and how that's constructed from a mash standpoint. And there's some producers that will do a rye that's really, really low in rye, and they'll do a rye for a bourbon drinker. Where do you find your rye sits, and how did you come about with that recipe?
We're 100% rye, and I think for us, in our rye whiskey, if we're going to make a rye whiskey, we want it to be as high a rye content as we could, and that creates some challenges that I'll let Brett speak to a little bit after talk about the product, in the mashing process, and I think that's why you don't see it very much. Obviously, we see the 95% rye in a lot of brands that's produced by MGP, and then after that, it really comes down to lower contents of rye. One factor is certainly cost. Rye is more expensive than corn. And so, if you're going to fall into that rye whiskey category, some producers, use that as a part of their decision making. The mashing process, like I mentioned, Brett will speak to on making 100% rye. And then, just different varieties of rye and how the yeasts play with them. What's interesting for me is, for the past decade plus, you're kind of beaten into your head that rye is a little more feisty and harder to maybe drink. And I just don't think
that's what they say.
That's what and I just don't think that's the case with our rye. I think it's very approachable. It's a neat drinker, and then it can also play really well in a cocktail. It has so much flavor and character that it can still come through when mixologists start adding their artistry to it. So, obviously we're seeing a lot more and more of that as people understand how to really produce a really quality rye whiskey.
I love that you say that, because I was just taking a sip of your 100% rye while you were talking there, and the first words that were coming to mind were soft, right? And I spot on with what you said there. We are so used to, it's brown grain and it brings us brown spiciness, and it's, you graduate to rye from bourbon. And this is just a wonderful, soft drinker here. Is that on purpose? Is that coming out of your production of that, Brett?
Yeah, I think so. We tried a lot of rye whiskeys in the beginning, and to your point, there was just the minimum amount of rye in there to call it a rye whiskey, because rye is a pain in the ass to deal with. Mm-hmm. And Orlin will attest, I've invented my own 4-letter words while making the rye because it's such a pain in the ass. But to me and Orlin, when tasting these ryes that are being produced with just the bare minimum amount of rye, they tasted more bourbon-esque versus more rye, because they had a lot of corn in them or a lot of malt and not enough rye. So when we were tasting them in the beginning of product development, we really were convinced we wanted to go the full way and do 100% rye, really highlight the beauty of that rye grain. And, a lot of the ryes we taste, I would get this dill note that I do not like that dill note. And so, how are we going to make a rye that doesn't have that dill note? Well, our ryes never, ever had that dill note. I don't know what to attribute that to, if it's the rye our farmer grows for us, if it's our controlled fermentations, it's the way we distill it. But I've never picked up that dill note in our rye whiskey. And I agree. We wanted to make rye an approachable spirit, and some ryes can be very harsh and unapproachable. And to your point, Jason, it is very, very soft, easy drinking whiskey.
So you're not pitching pickle juice in with the mash, is what you're saying.
Correct. Yeah, I'm not a pickle fan. That's where that dill note gets me.
What I like about this is it's not just that it's soft. There's a really pleasant drying characteristic to it on the finish that is just really enjoyable. I finished the bourbon while y'all were talking before, and I just poured this rye, and it's been a really nice one to sip on.
Yeah, it's really grain forward as well. Mm-hmm. Like if you wanted to take ownership for having 100% rye, I think you've delivered on what's made it into the bottle on that one.
So I think with the rye, just from a white dog distillate standpoint, rye tastes significantly better off the still. It doesn't have the corn can create a little bit more of the young characteristic that you taste, but rye is much more refined. And so, exactly to your point, we've had some of our rye that's aged a little longer, and it starts that grain character that's so prevalent in it starts to kind of go away. The barrel starts to overtake it a little bit, and so definitely like that balance of where it's at in age and maturity, and still getting a little bit of that grain profile coming through without tasting young.
Mm-hmm. Well, and it takes me back to what you'd said earlier about looking to create a product with balance, and I'm sure a lot of people come along and talk about balance, but in tasting this, and I'd asked you earlier about Woodinville DNA as well, if you're really taking ownership for balance, and as I taste this rye, there's no one element really overwhelms the experience. There's not too much wood coming in and overframing. There's not too much grain coming in and you lose some of that wood. There's a pleasant spice, but certainly not an overbearing spice that we talked about. It really is sitting in harmony. It feels like a very well-crafted rye whiskey.
Yep, I'll agree with everything you just said there, Jason.
Well, thank you.
They're blushing, just for the benefit of the listeners. They're blushing like nobody's business right now.
Please continue.
He's almost there, Jason. So, we started off the conversation where I feel as if something I said may have sounded as if I was shitting a bit on the craft whiskey movement within the U.S. And I hope it didn't come off that way. It surely wasn't my intent. But all one needs to do is hop on Facebook or Twitter or some sort of online platform where you get a lot of bourbon traditionalists who are just that, bourbon traditionalists. And if it's not made in Kentucky or coming out of MGP in Indiana, they're hesitant. And so, just back to your beginnings as a distillery, a bourbon and rye distillery out of Seattle, what challenges have you been facing over the years in trying to get the attention of the traditionalist? And are you seeing those successes? Are you still pushing water uphill? What does that look like?
If I had $1 for what you said to begin with about the expectations of what of a craft whiskey, man, it would be a large wallet. But Brett and I heard that. I wanted to back up and address this when you first said it. When you were talking about how did we get here? Brett and I heard that loud and clear. We were the guys on these forums. We were whiskey drinkers. I mean, we've drinking all of this before we were making our own products. So we always had that litmus test, like, would I pay $40-50 of my hard-earned money for what we're putting in a bottle right now?
Yeah.
And if you can't look yourself in the eye, your family's always telling you this is great and your friends and all that, but at the end of the day, you can't lie to yourself. Yeah. And we, just like until we had a product that we felt could pass that test, we weren't going to put it in a bottle. And so, absolutely, that was almost a challenge to us early on, because that sentiment's been going on for quite some time, and we didn't want to be a part of that. And we did fight it a little bit with the small barrels, but we were trying to have people understand our evolution here. Like, look, we're kind of here's unaged whiskey, here's small barreled whiskey, but we're really working to get towards a fully matured whiskey that can compete with the best of the best. And that really comes down to time. At the end of the day, it just to have a whiskey that's matured 5 to 6 years that can compete with the ones that are competitive set on the shelf. It just takes some time, and that's the biggest challenge in craft whiskey and in just distilleries in general. That's why you haven't seen very many distilleries, since Prohibition just pop up out of the blue, because of the financial challenges of making product every single day for years and years and years and not selling the vast majority of it, until year 5-6.
Mm-hmm.
So are you still fighting that? Do you still have people saying, well, it's It's not Wild Turkey. It's not Buffalo Trace. And we keep on going back to a conversation that we had with the folks at Bespoken, and Jason brings it up. I've been bringing it up now and again as well, where the whiskey drinking community is not a monolith. And so the question is that even your market? I think your whiskeys fit well within the category of, that this tastes like a traditional product. This is fantastic, but you're producing it in a non-traditional state, and you don't have the hundreds of years of history or decades of history, depending on the distillery that they have. And so I'm just curious where you're finding yourselves as you break into more markets.
I think for me, till the day I die, someone was going to say they won't drink it because it's not made in Kentucky. There's those purists out there. You're never going to change their mind no matter what. But I think that for me, the biggest eye-opener was, we were only selling our products in Washington State until 2018. And that's when we moved into our first market out of the state and moved into California. And so Orlin and I flew down there, and the plan was for us to go meet some key accounts and taste them on our products. And I think we had the conversation was like, have we been successful? Because, we had the support of we're the hometown guys, and we had the support of Washington. How are we going to fare outside in a whole new market, being a bourbon and a rye whiskey not from Kentucky? And it was a little nerve-wracking when you're walking into some of these big liquor buyers, and they're tasting your product, and you're waiting for their reaction. Are they going to spit it out? Are they going to say this is crap? And it blew me away, the responses I got from all these meetings. These guys would taste the whiskey, and the look on their face was utter shock, because they expected it to not be good. In their mind, they had already made their mind up it wasn't going to be good. It's a craft whiskey made in Seattle. This is not going to be good. And the reactions and the surprise and how blown away they were by the flavor and how well the product was made was kind of an affirmation for Orlin and I that, all right, we really did make something that was excellent. We're very proud of.
Real quick story. I remember one particular bar at a very, very well-respected thought leader whiskey bar in San Francisco. And we would sit, we'd go in and we sat down, and I'd introduce myself and do the dog and pony show. Hi, I'm Orlin. I'm the co-founder of Woodinville. We make everything from grain to bottle in Washington State. We grow our grains on the Almond family farm. We mash, distill, age in Woodinville. Products aged for 5 to 6 years, and I would love for you to try it. And, you could tell they weren't really paying attention. I just told them all these details for 5 or 10 minutes, and then smell and taste. And you say, it's like, so where do you make this? And you make this? Where did you where did you buy this? Did this come from who? And it's like just the two. He had no connection between the two whatsoever until finally, obviously we connected it for him, and it was we've had a great relationship with him ever since. It's those big wins. It's funny, you get into a handful of those key accounts and everybody looks up to as thought leaders in the whiskey community, in those metro areas, and it just takes off from there.
Well, and that kind of ties in with what I'm curious about, which is the way Joshua described it, and you chaps both lived it. The word craft was used in the pejorative, and it was kind of a shorthand and easy way to dismiss someone. Do you, and this could be a multifaceted answer here, but do you use the word craft? Do you have need for the word craft? Do you want to retake the word craft, or are you in a different plane? Like, is the fact that we keep talking about craft a 10-year-old conversation, and the industry itself, the market itself, has evolved beyond that? What's your position on that?
Well, I think if you look at our bottle, it says not craft whiskey, it says real craft whiskey. So craft has gotten a bad connotation over the last 10 years. Everybody's aware of that. And so we were like, all right, we are making bourbon in a craft environment. We don't have giant 4-story tall column stills. We're doing batch distillation. I mean, everything we're doing is in a craft environment. So we're considered craft, but we're real craft whiskey is kind of our tagline on our bottle and all of our cases.
And, for me, it comes down to a fair amount of semantics at the end of the day. And, I don't remember who it was that used this analogy, but to tell Jimmy Russell that what he's doing isn't craft would be, a slap in the
Right.
face. So, there's a lot of these distilleries, huge distilleries, as we know, making incredible products, and they have been for quite some time. So this isn't really like, trying to say that craft is better. But for me, I think it's more about craft can be creative, the terroir. We have a little bit more flexibility in somewhere where you're sometimes bound to tradition, where, we can age whiskey in Washington State, and it can take on the terroir of a drier, warmer climate in Eastern Washington, and we can see the differences. If our whiskey were aging in Kentucky, it would taste different than it does here in Washington State. And so, embracing those types of that craft is going to be a little bit outside of the box. I really think is what it's all about. And the stigma certainly exists to some degree, but it's not just us that we're not the only craft distillery putting out some, really good products, and they're being recognized. I think there's a dozen distilleries throughout the country that are that are making their own product. They're doing good things and are being recognized for it by, the larger whiskey thought leaders.
And that's kind of, to my mind, the stratification of the industry, where a decade ago when you come in, you're not in Kentucky. You're not a massive distillery with multiple decades of history. But over these 10 years, you're not a craft distiller just in the door making this up today and figuring this out. You're 10 years into this. I've got Catoctin Creek just up the road from me with Becky and Scott Harris, and they're a decade into this. And so do you think there is this stratification where, look, we'll never be Kentucky. Well, we might have the history, another 50, 60, 70 years in the future, but we're not going to do what Kentucky's doing. We're doing what we're doing in Woodinville. Can you take control of that level of it, that layer of it, and make that your own? Is that even a goal?
No, now look, now we're both quiet. It's like
I thought the elk behind Brett was going to start talking.
After a few too many whiskeys, it does.
Yeah, really just certainly, to your first point, American whiskey or craft whiskey distilleries coming of age certainly, has changed the dynamic. We're a more mature product, and that's a big element to it. But Brett and I have kind of this saying where we are paying respect to the time-honored traditions of bourbon production that are absolutely ingrained in American history, even in a craft environment. And how can we apply best practices to all of that? So using estate-grown grain on our farm, knowing the exact specs on everything, to the mashing process, to the controlled fermentation, to the hand distillation process, to the barrels that we use. And not to say that this isn't done in the macro environment, but every piece of our production process is analyzed on how we can do it the best way possible.
Yeah, yeah, and I loved how you started the conversation when we asked about your beginnings, and obviously you led with your story, but you immediately brought in. Oh, Jesus Christ, why am I having such a brain fart?
Dave Pickerel?
Yeah, Dave Pickerel. I've drunk with Dave. I slept in his room. Not like that. I slept in his room at
Can I slip this in?
Or the Whistle Pig House. Anyway, and your story sounds a little bit like Hill Rock, and it's clear he's done wonderful things with Hill Rock. He's done wonderful things with you. I think, as I step back and I think about not just Woodinville as a bourbon producer or Hill Rock as a bourbon producer, both being, Pickerel projects, but globally speaking, you have distilleries around the world that have had wonderful mentors that are deserved of praise. You know, you think of all the Jim Swan distilleries in Israel and in Wales and in Taiwan, and Malcolm Rennie in Scotland getting some of those distilleries up and running. But I think what has you guys stand out in my mind is back to some of the farming that you talked about. And so this is a two-parter. Was Dave working with you guys before Hill Rock? Because I know you're both doing your own farming. And is that where you guys came from? Were you farmers before this and then brought that in to produce your whiskey? Because I realized we didn't touch on that side of your origin story.
No, we're far from being farmers. That's for sure. Early on, we started a relationship with the Omlins over in Quincy, Washington, where all of our grain is grown. Mm-hmm. So when we first started out, we actually were certified organic facility. We were making organic products. And it became a challenge to get consistent supply of grain that didn't have live worms in it and all these different things, just because of the organic farming process. And so we decided pretty quickly that organic is not the way to go. People are drinking whiskey. Do they really care if it's organic? That was kind of the thought we had. And so Orlin did some reaching out to some grain suppliers, and we kind of had to have a specialty one because we needed it bagged in super sacks, delivered to us on pallets so we could process it in our facility. And a lot of the big producers couldn't do that. And so they gave Orlin Arnie's name, and Orlin contacted Arnie, and that's kind of how the relationship started with him growing the grain for Woodinville. And Orlin can jump in and give more detail on that side of things if he'd like.
Yeah, so I don't know that there's a correlation between the Hill Rock identity and the estate grown and what we were doing. Obviously, we were developing the relationship with the small family farm in Eastern Washington that, we could have as much control over the grain growing and quality process as possible. But certainly something that, now is part of our brand DNA, this family, and, it's not truly a state, distillery because we're not distilling and aging and doing everything there, but our barreling happens on that farm, our bottling happens on that farm, our aging, everything, the grain is grown right there, and really a key part to just the overall quality control mantra that Brett and I have.
Gotcha.
I'm curious, just as we kind of look to the future, and we've kind of talked a little bit about the business side of this. Obviously, you're in Washington State. Obviously, you've got high taxes for the consumer there. Distribution. In February we had the Treasury report that maybe put the first kind of shake into the post-prohibition 3-tier system. It'll be interesting to see where that goes. But do you have direct-to-consumer sales in Washington? Are you able to service demand directly within that state? And where do you hope sales of whiskey go for you in the future? And by that I mean selling to consumers, not your sales numbers. That's none of my damn business. But what would help you, grow?
More whiskey. More whiskey. Yeah. We're really limited on our growth by our available inventory. Obviously, since our partnership with Moat Hennessy, we've invested quite a bit in increasing production, 6x volume increase on that side of things to try to help, meet demand. But no, we're only distributed in about 20 states because that's all and all of those states are allocated on what we are able to provide them on a given year. We are able to sell direct to consumers and ship to them within Washington State. That's really all we do. But you ask a great question, and it comes from there's the business side of things, and yes, would there be higher margins if I could go direct to consumer? And and be removing some of wholesalers and potentially some retailers. But those are also the people that have helped us build this brand, right? Our distributor relationships and the retailers and all of those people. So, it's really difficult for me to say, I want to go direct to everybody and take all that money when we have this incredible partnership with these people that have helped us build these brands. For me, more of the maybe direct to consumer through those avenues where our where our retailers are able to, ship direct to consumers. And we're seeing obviously a lot more of that with obviously the Reserve Bars and the Drizzlies and the different places that we can order from now. But it's just so, as you know, we can only ship to these states, the disclaimers on the bottom when you're trying to get a bottle here and there. And I think it's just a matter of time until these archaic laws are somewhat, opened up to create a bit of a more free market within the spirits industry.
Yeah, I think your point is a really good one. Everybody wants to make more money if they could, but so many brands wouldn't be where they are now if they didn't have the right distributor, if they didn't have the right retailers backing them up, and all the sales team at the distributorships, the people on the retail shop floors. It really is important.
Which I think speaks to the good relationships in the good states. You then start to throw in franchise states where you might get picked up as an early brand, wait for you to get hot in other states, but maybe they haven't done much with you in that particular state. So they've got ownership of you. I think freeing up some of that could be beneficial for producers and certainly for consumers as well.
Absolutely. Look, especially in our evolution, one of the biggest blessings that was somewhat in disguise for Brett and I we were just distributed in Washington State through 2017. And that was much different business philosophy than a lot of craft producers that were, selling in 20, 50 cases a month into a dozen, 20, 25 broad distribution states versus our thought process was, let's build a brand with roots in a market that we can support. We're a young brand. We don't have $1 million marketing budgets, but we can get out on the streets. We can do events. We can meet people. We can be here in our home state and be a relevant player. So even though we were only in one state, we were competing, in sales from a volume standpoint with some of the largest Kentucky brands that you would, at our price point. And then that allowed us, it gave us the strength, it gave us the roots here in Washington to be able to do what we've, expand into 20 states and just doing it the right way, which, just like making whiskey takes time and discipline.
Nice. Brett, did you want to add on to anything there?
I'm good. I think Orlin pretty much covered it pretty well.
Cool. I've got one more question. I know we're just hitting the hour mark on my recording here. I've got one more question, and then there's a question we always throw out to get out of here. And now that I've framed it, I'm having a Joshua Hatton brain fart, and I can't remember what my question was.
The worst. I blame the rye. We should go 99% rye. I would have kept that one brain cell.
Okay. Thank you for stalling for me. I got my question back.
There you go.
So we've been in this about a decade. You guys have been in this about a decade. And this is a question that we get all the time from our own listeners. And I'm going to pitch it to you two. As we've spoken today, it sounds like a wonderful journey. Sounds like everything that's gone right could go right. As you look back over 10 years, is there any one thing that stands out that if you could go back and do it differently, you would?
We get that. We've got that question before, and we can get into the weeds on little things and whatnot. But man, I got to be honest. I feel blessed to the journey we've been on. It's storybook. It almost it sounds a little bit cheesy, but to be able to accomplish, to do what we've been able to do, and then, be able to come into the Moët Hennessy family, an organization that, the brands in that portfolio have been there for hundreds and hundreds of years. And that's, where we all see Woodinville going together. I don't know that I would have done much different. If you want to get into the weeds with some of the products early on, well, maybe we should have done a little more of this, or maybe we should have made a little bit more of this. Certainly can get into that. But, No, they're not a big fundamental issue that I would change.
Nice.
No, we were pretty lucky, especially I'll go back to Dave. I mean, he gave us a lot of good advice in the beginning, and we really followed it, and we didn't really stray from that. And there's a lot of tough decisions as a starting business, and especially in the whiskey world, where we had to really make some tough decisions. And, Orlin and I would analyze it, and really, at the end of the day, we just trust our gut feeling and go with it. And that's the direction we were going. And, most of the time our gut was always right. And it didn't seem right, but we trusted our gut, and we went with it. And, we're here today talking with you guys, so obviously our guts were kind of right. So...
Yeah, no, to be honest with you, our answer tends to go along a similar path, which is, no, we've actually made it through the first 10 years. We're actually okay with how things went. Our thing is always if we could buy more casks at 10 years ago pricing or 8 years ago or 5 years ago. Wish we could have done more of that in the moment. But other than that, yeah, we mostly made right decisions along the way. So
my answer to you was going to be the one thing I'd do different would be make more whiskey. But I remember those times when we were making as much as we could, and I'm thinking, how the hell are we going to pay for this? So,
yeah, it's that game of your business owners. There's risk. What level of risk are you comfortable with? And then you only know with hindsight what you should have done differently. That's the only way you ever know.
Well, it's funny because the bankers in the beginning didn't quite understand. So you're going to increase your production, but you're not going to see $1 for 5 years? They didn't understand. They couldn't wrap their mind around that.
That's a hard sell, isn't it? Gosh.
Oh man, if I often have daydreams about the bankers that said no to us earlier on. I'd just love to go back to them and just say, you had your position. Here's where we are now. Thank you very much. It was a nice conversation. All right. But that's all the past. With the past behind us, let's look toward the future. You're in 20 states now. You've been part of the LVMH family for a few years now. What are you excited for moving forward with your production? Is it more whiskey? Is it more states? Is it growing outside of the U.S. now that some of those tariffs have started to drop? What do you got going on that is exciting you at the moment, next year, next 5 years?
Well, generally speaking, from exact yes to all those things you just said, from production and expansion, and Brett's now running a very large operation that's producing hundreds and hundreds of thousands of cases a year, and we're kind of coming into that next level of big boy distillery, if you will. And it's a challenging operation for Brett. We're constantly challenged with all of the dynamics that come along with that. I think for me, the flexibility now to be able to age products longer, to do different finishes now that we have a little bit of volumes, to play with, and really look at how we are going to enter those broader markets with our core products, and become a national and potentially global whiskey brand in the next decade.
Beauty. Brett?
Yeah, I'm just like Orlin said, just having the volumes of whiskey for experimentation purposes. Obviously, we've done a lot of experiments on barrel finishing. I don't know if you guys have tried our port finish bourbon.
No.
That was an experiment years ago that it was received so well, it became part of our core lineup in all of our markets now. We've done a lot of every year we do a harvest release at the distillery where it's some kind of unique twist on our bourbon or our rye. Last year we did a Muscatel finished bourbon.
Ooh, nice.
We made a lot of it. We still have a lot available. We're still actually aging some more.
Okay.
But we got these 10-year-old Muscatel barrels. They were very rare through the supplier that gets us our port barrels. And it turned out phenomenal. So that's exciting because we have whiskey to start playing with different finishes. I've done a Chardonnay barrel bourbon finish, a Syrah. I've done a Madeira. working on some cognac and Armagnac finishes. Just all kinds of different experiments going on right now. And, on a very small scale. And then, our tasting room in Woodinville is kind of our testing ground. We get instantaneous feedback from the consumer. We can see the sales through the register on what products are resonating with the consumers. And that's kind of how the port really became a more mainstay product in our lineup. Okay. It's just by the demand for it.
That's excellent. It's wonderful having that little loop where you can check. I think you were maybe saying this earlier, Orlin, which is friends and family can tell you a whole host of things. You can't lie to yourself, nor can you get money from consumers when you're selling them something they don't want. So it's nice to have that kind of validity in your back pocket as well. Validation, I think, is the word. Absolutely,
yeah. Our tasting room's been a key platform to our success, like so many craft distillers, but we're in a very tourist-oriented area. We have quite a few people come through the facility, and it's really we can learn a lot, just as much as they learn a lot about Woodinville. We can learn a lot from them and really, make sure we're doing the right thing with our products.
Thanks again to Brett and Orlin from Woodinville Whisky Company. What a treat.
We'll give them their Sunday name. Oh, Woodinville, 3 names.
Is that on their birth certificate? Woodinville Whisky Company?
Distilleries always have birth certificates, yes. It is. That is. Woodinville, 3 names is on their birth certificate.
So company is the surname, right? Whiskey is your middle name, and Woodinville. Anyway. Listening back to that conversation was good for me. I've told you this, and I've told our listeners probably far too many times that it's become clear to me I need to have a better understanding of the overall, operations, the procedures of how to make bourbon, how to make rye. I feel as if I've got a much better understanding when it comes to malt whiskey, although, just like you, it's still a learning, right? We're still learning all the time. But I feel as if my bourbon and my rye knowledge really needs to step up a little bit. And so it was nice listening back to the conversation. I'd forgotten that you had asked that question about a sweet mash versus a sour mash, right? Because they do a sweet mash rather than a sour mash, and it's so interesting when you look at various bourbon labels. They always highlight sour mash.
Absolutely.
I can count on a single hand the number of times I've seen sweet mash. I know that, who are those people? They also start with a W. Woodford. Yeah, that's it. Woodford. Woodford had released a sweet mash whiskey. I think you have to be at a distillery that starts with a W to do sweet mash whiskeys, right?
So far, 2 for 2 on that analysis.
Woodford. Oh, and they have to have woods in the word. Woods in the word.
Talk about, I don't know if you're in the woods. You're certainly in the weeds.
But that was a really interesting thing to listen back to. And also, you touching on the yeast bit and the fact that they played around with a little bit of champagne yeast to see what that did to their whiskey. And they found, the champagne yeast was actually increasing the amount of alcohol in their they called it a beer basically, but in their wash, and what that can do to whiskey. So it was nice. It was a good explorative conversation for me.
Yeah, no, far ranging, and I like it. It's, as we said leading into this, that craft word is always around. It's always in the background, and maybe we'll get to a point where we get to move away from the importance of that word, but to get into a nerdy conversation with guys who have built this over the last 10 years, have a reason for doing everything they're doing. It's really cool to pick at the process and start to ask some of those questions about cask maturation and yeast mash. It was great. I I really did thoroughly enjoy it. It was a real fun conversation. And like you, I learned a ton. And I hope our listeners have enjoyed it as much as I said I thought they would as we led into it.
Yeah, I think another learning moment for me as well, we were talking about the rye. And I had asked, when you said mash, it reminded me of this, right? So I asked them what their mash bill was for their rye. And, right, I don't have a bottle of the Woodinville rye in front of me. I just, like you, I had the samples. But in tasting that rye...
Thanks to Elijah.
Thanks to Elijah. Thank you again. But in tasting that rye, it had a softer entry. And so...
Very much so.
Based on the taste alone, I was working on an assumption that it was a mixed grain mash bill. And we came to find out, and if I just looked at the little sample label again, it would have said, this is 100% rye. And it just goes to show you that not all rye is created equal, that it can present itself in many different ways. And I'm sure that gets down not just to grain, but also to process as well. So if there's people out there who have been on the fence about rye, thought it's too big, too spicy, Woodinville may be the thing for you because it did have that softer approach, and it did have that, I got that sense of, are there other grains here? It's not so boom in your face. It was more approachable if you wanted a more approachable rye. So yeah, that was again, going back to that conversation, listening to it again and educating myself on what grains can and can't do. Now, more can do, depending on how you work with them. Yeah.
Multifaceted.
Yeah, exactly.
Let's get out of this portion here. But can you give us a little bit of music? Don't wake the paper boy.
Oh,
just give us a little bit of music, because I'm going to say something about rye on the other side of this music. We have been informing our dear listeners about the transport of our backwoods Australian heritage rye bottling. And it had been at sea. Then it had been waiting for a point of entry. It had since, amazingly, found a point of entry into these United States of America. And the hope is that as this episode goes live, it may be on a 4-wheeled vehicle, actually a 6-wheeled vehicle, on its way to the warehouse in San Francisco.
You are scaring me with the potential. This is very jinxable. This whole thing is very jinxable.
Very jinxable.
6 wheels. What
but we've come this far,
wheels?
Right? We've come this far. March landing, April landing, May landing. Now here we are in the middle of May, and it might be getting to a warehouse sometime in the very near future, but also maybe not. So,
why are you
we're talking rye. I want to celebrate our Australian rye from backwoods.
Why are you dodging my question as to what vehicle has 6 wheels?
You're clearly not a rural boy. For us down in the Shenandoah Valley, the dualies all go by with their 6 wheels.
Oh.
I'm also thinking about a large delivery truck, whether it may potentially have 2 in the front and 4 in the back.
All right.
I just don't want to be solely focused on 4-wheel delivery vehicles when 6-wheeled vehicles are out there doing good work as well.
We must recognize these 6-wheel vehicles year over year over year are not being recognized for the hard work that they've done.
Tell you what was fun about, just talking about delivery vehicles, what was fun about being in Chicago was seeing an underground world of delivery trucks. Like, so many buildings exist beneath what you would consider the main roadway of Chicago. Like,
It's
insane. What's that little portion where you drive underground? The Willamette? Whacker. Wacky.
Yeah, it's Whacker.
It is Whacker.
Yeah, it's Whacker. That's where I got whacked in my car accident.
Miles of Whacker exists under the main frame of Chicago, and deliveries are happening all day long. It's wild.
That's
wild.
That's wiggity Whacker.
Yeah, I love that part. So there you go. So I just wanted to give an update on the Backwoods, see where things are going. We got some other things releasing shortly. Probably not going to be covered by this episode. So we will have a more full news in the next episode.
Indeed. Jason, I would like to, and I hope you'll agree. I would like to do two things before we get out of here.
Oh, okay.
And trust me, we're not getting out of here that quickly.
Anytime soon.
Or that easily. But what I would like to do is see if we can give another Blind Barrels sample a go.
Okay.
And then we actually have 2 new comments that came in on the Apple Podcast, right? See, we asked our listeners, we said, please give us a 5-star rating, and please say something when you give that rating. Make a comment, and we'll read it on the podcast, on the Padcast. And so people have been. So I wanted to read one of the 2 before we get out of here. But before we read that, I would love to do another blind tasting, and I would love for you to select, or you can fan out the envelopes and have me select which one we're going to do. You'll do the reading after we're done tasting.
So I have a hunch. That we are revisiting this after we covered it in the last episode because we couldn't have been more wrong in our guessing. And you're going to disagree with me that we couldn't be more wrong. You're going to find all the things we did well. But we both guessed Scotch single malt, potentially Scotch blend, and it turned out to be a Japanese single malt.
Well, I will...
You're going to say, but...
I will say that you were 100% more wrong than I was because you went with a blend. What I would say the both of us got right, however, is I think the tasting notes worked out, right? When we read back Seabass's own tasting notes, some of our tasting notes lined up, right? With the sea hay and the fruitiness. And so, yeah, I think yeah. When you've been with someone, you and I have been doing this together, these whiskey circles for a dozen years, if not, a little bit longer. But I'm trying to do math, just like you, Joshua, doing math on the fly ain't working. But so let's say we've been doing this for about a dozen years. It's so interesting that I knew I could set you up for that exact defense of our last blind tasting. I knew exactly what you were going to say. Huh.
And all of this has allowed me an opportunity to shuffle the envelopes. So we shuffled last time, and I blindly chose A.
All right.
We are shuffled this time, Joshua, and you are going to blindly choose...
which side is your right side? Okay, I would like the one all the way to the right, please. That's the one. The very one. Yep.
You, sir, have chosen sample C.
C. Oh, C. Give me some C words.
No.
Consistency. Craft. Where was your mind going, Jason? Constable.
I just knew you were setting me up. Colonel Angus, the name of your cat. I knew you were setting me up.
Colonel Angus.
So.
Yeah.
So just very quickly, once again, Blind Barrels is a sample supplying outfit here in the United States, sending blind samples plus descriptions plus notes to your doorstep. Check them out, blindbarrels.com.
And the package comes with, at least the package that we got, came with 4 different blind samples. You taste them, the reveal comes later. But just, a reminder for our listeners, while in our last episode we tasted sample A and revealed what it was, in this episode we're tasting sample C and will reveal what it is. For those of you out there listening, these are not official blind barrel samples, so as not to give the game away for those who look to sign up. We're tasting Seabass's, Christopher Sebastian's own samples. So this is from his own collection here.
If I was nervous the first time we did this, I'm really nervous the second time we're doing this. So
I haven't poured mine yet, but this one has that sort of deep gold color, but like first fill bourbon.
I'm going to make the exact same offer that I made in the last episode.
All right.
I'm going to make the exact same guess. I'm going to make that exact same guess 4 times because it's guaranteed to be right one of those 4, right? There's only 4 whiskeys in the world. I got to get it right one time.
All right, here we go. So, okay, now this, I'm getting a bit of peat on the nose. Well, look, back up. Let's take a look at the color again. Let's take a look at the legs, and I really liked what you did last time, Jason, with the shake test, where you look at the bubbles and you try to guess an ABV before we taste.
Yeah, what did you just say a second ago for the color? Like kind of a rich gold?
Yeah, like a rich gold. As if this were a 20-something-year-old Scotch whiskey in first fill bourbon, right? So it's got that sort of deeper, bright gold going on.
Tremendous legs again. Wonderfully, deliciously oily going on here. Wonderful unctuousness.
Do you notice an unusual beading just at the top of the legs?
What do you mean by unusual?
Well, there's a lot of little beads that are staying where they are without turning into legs for mine.
I do. I have that exact effect.
Okay.
Not all the way around. I do have some large droplets coming down the side in some other spots. But
grab a napkin then, Jason. Seriously. This looks like...
Sometimes when I see that little beading that you're describing, it almost looks like a seam in an article of clothing.
Yeah.
Like just that real tight bead.
Agreed, but it looks like a drunk person was sewing the seam of love there. Sewing the seam of love. The seam of love. Sewing the seam. Oh, wow. So
I haven't done the shake test yet, but the few times that I've nosed it, something is caught in the back of my throat. And it could be the fact that we are recording this early on a Sunday morning, and I don't really have my full alcohol legs about me just yet.
Yeah.
I also, so we'll do the shake test in just a second. The other thing for me is when I first poured it, I couldn't help. I gave it a swirl and I gave it a sniff, and I got this big bright fruit coming at me. Mm-hmm. And then behind the fruit was something a bit more peaty, a bit more earthy.
Yep.
And now as we examine it and turn it and twist it, I'm starting to get something a little funky. Almost a little bit of that pickled onion, the Monster Munch, crisps, which is technically a corn snack in the UK. But I've definitely got a little pickling going on in here on the nose.
Yeah, so I did the same, right? I went straight to the nose, and the first thing that I got was a shock of alcohol to the nose, right? It seemed like this is a very volatile spirit that's sort of stabbing my nostrils. So I'm going to guess, just from the sniff test alone, I'm going to guess it's a higher ABV. And then I got what I thought was peat initially. And then the more I went back to the nose, the more I feel, is this some sort of a funky sulfury quality, right, that you find in a Craigellachie, or you find sometimes in younger Mortlochs or something like that?
Craigellachie did cross my mind from the nose.
But then I remember getting, and this was years ago, this was probably 10 years ago or so, getting a single cask of Old Pulteney. And it was their Clipper series. I forget what the Clipper series is. And it was from an Amontillado sherry cask, and it just reeked of dirty socks. And it was this sulfury quality coming from the cask rather than from the spirit, because Pulteney is not really a peated spirit, so it was a funk. And this has that similar kind of dirty sock, yet in a good way, kind of funk going on.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, the bubbles are inconclusive. They're dissipating very quickly. If I was to hazard a guess, I might say 52.
Oh, wow. That low?
Yeah. Oh, yeah. There was just not enough bubbles to go higher than that. I'm also looking at it.
Yeah.
I almost hazard a guess between 48 and 52. But if I trust the bubbles and believe in the bubbles, I'm gonna go to the 52 end of that.
Interesting. See, if I were to trust my nose alone, which I shouldn't do because there's been plenty of 60+% alcohol whiskeys that I've noticed that haven't stung my nose. This one is really stinging my nose.
You think more so than just an early Sunday morning recording?
Yeah. It could be. It could be that. Have you sipped it yet?
I have. After I did the bubble test, I took a little sip.
Do you have any notes from the nose? Well, you talked pickled onions, right? We talked a bit of sulfur.
Yeah.
Any fruitiness, any nuttiness coming through?
Not nutty, but I definitely, in poking my nostrils around the edges, there's still fruit there. There's a little combination of fruit and funk with something a little bit pickled and a little bit earthy.
Yeah.
And I'm trying to be, I would say, better than we were in the last episode, where the grain suggested single malt, or at least a malted barley component to it, and our mind stuck to Scotland. Already you've said Craigellachie, and I agreed with that. A little bit of that pickled onion had me thinking Lechig, right?
Yeah, it's not Lechig, I don't think. Declarative statement.
Declarative, there you go. But look, you and I have done this again, right? Where we got tripped up on the first sample, and it was Japanese. Here we are saying the same things we said that time, which is, okay, who in Scotland is doing this? Can you expand beyond Scotland and get something familiar out of this? Takes us out of familiar territory?
Potentially, but as I'm tasting, while you were talking, I was giving it a go, and I got some fruitiness.
Giving me your full 25%.
You asked me if I can go outside the scope of Scotland. I said potentially, but I wanted to bring it back to the notes before I wanted to explain my experience to you, and obviously my experience means nothing to you, Jason.
No, the fact that while I was talking, you were tasting. I know when you're tasting, you're not listening. So I know that I had your full 25%.
You had a solid 27%, Jason.
Lies. More like 23.
So as I was tasting this, I was getting a lot of fruit. Really, really tasted like sherry-driven fruit coming through. But there was also a bit of butyric acid. There was that little milkiness going on, which kind of reminded me of, what you get sometimes from a lightly peated Glen Scotia. Or sometimes a Bruichladdich, but this doesn't really feel like a Bruichladdich to me. And so now, if I'm to open up the borders a little bit outside of Scotland, per your request.
I know that's not easy. That's not an easy request to make of an American, is to open the borders, but do go on.
You know our motto, malt first. Yeah, I'm trying to think if I've had any experience of whiskeys outside of Scottish single malt where I'd get a similar experience of sulfur or butyric acid. And I can't remember an instance where I did that. Maybe an odd Karazawa, but But I think that,
which in my experience burns hotter than the sun.
right, and that's why I don't think it's a Kurosawa, because I can actually swallow this.
I will say the nose is really delicious. I'm almost getting some kind of roasted marshmallow sweetness building out of this.
Oh, there's like a baked apple quality to it in the front of the palate as well. It's so interesting on the nose. You know, after you take the first sip, on the nose, that sort of sulfury quality kind of goes away a little bit. The fruitiness sort of kicks in. And that second sip, I'm getting that baked apple. There's a bright sweetness there that's followed by a bit of nutmeg, that's followed by a bit of warm cinnamon.
Which is why when you make that comment about the sherry component to this,
Yeah.
I'm getting such an active bourbon cask suggestion from that nutmeg, from that cinnamon. Like I feel like bourbon cask here, but I liked what you said about some of that sulfury, a little bit of those sherry fruits there.
So,
Unless this is one of a couple of obvious things, I'm really lost on this sample. I think it's delicious, but I'm really lost on it.
I would drink the living hell out of this. I think that this is absolutely
absolutely
wonderful. But
Yep. Upon the reveal, I'm going to check if any's available.
so, I do want.
I like what you said about the Glen Scotia. I thought your Glen Scotia comment was a good one. But we're firmly in Scotland in our brains again.
Yeah, I do think we are. I want to say, oh my gosh, Jason. Mm-hmm. The 19-year-old refill sherry Kregeliki single cask that that Holly turned us on to was 52% alcohol, and you said you thought that this was around 52, right? Could it be that? Like, remember how floored we were by that whiskey? But it's been a while.
I felt like that had more pronounced sherry to it, but I'm going from pandemic memory of multiple years ago, 3 years ago.
So let me, because I was going to ask you a question, and then I had that revelation, that possible connection to a very specific bottling. As you continue to nose this, as you continue to taste it, and you think about that funky element, do you think that it's peat driven or sulfur driven, be it spirit or cask, or a bit of both?
Yeah, it's a difficult question to answer because I'm not believing in the sherry component as much as you are.
I'm sold.
At the same time, it doesn't seem to be expressly bourbon cask maturation. So I do think there's peated barley in play here. I'm willing to believe you that there is a sherried component to it, but I like the baking spices that what I consider a bourbon cask to be delivering is delivering here. And I finished my sample. You talked about the drinkability of it. The question is, do you like it? 1,000 times yes. I like it a whole ton. And aside from our Glen Scotia, potential Lechig, Kregeliki guesses, I don't have much else up my sleeve on it.
So talking about liking it, I poured a little extra because I finished mine as well. All right.
I'm about to.
So here we are. Gun to your head. What is it? Gun to your head, Jason. What is it?
Kregeliki.
Kregeliki. I'm thinking the exact same. I'm thinking it's a Kregeliki of some sort of sherry maturation. All right. Age. What do you think? Give me a range. Like, you know, even I will give you the span of 6 years.
The bubbles were moving so quickly, I thought young, but the legs are moving so slowly, I thought old.
Yeah.
And so If it's Craigellachie, I'm going to go down the path. And if you've given me 6 years each way, I'm going to say 13 because I'm hedging my bets and I'm quite a smart person.
Look at you using math to your advantage. Yeah, I too am going to say Craigellachie. I really feel that it is a sherry cask, likely second fill, potentially refill, but a somewhat active refill. I don't think that this is peated, which is why I think it's Craigellachie, right?
Oh, interesting. Okay, you think there's that, even from a tiny percentage of peated malt in there?
Right. But here's a very good example. Tamdhu peats their barley to around 2 ppm, and it's imperceptible. It just comes through as a facet of earthiness. And then if you recall the Glenmorangie Finalta, which was their peated offering, again, 8 to 12 years ago, that was 5 ppm, but the peat was you could perceive the peat. You could detect it. And so if there is peat here, I would say it's not so much as 5 ppm like it was Glenmorangie. It's got to be a bit, for that Glenmorangie Finalta, it's got to be a bit less than that. I really think that this is a sulfur-driven funkiness, earthiness going on. Is the C for Craigellachie?
We do not have the chutzpah to open these ahead of time and cheat. And so I'm going to put the envelope close to my microphone and see if you can hear me ripping it. Don't open it. Don't open it.
I'm not. I'm just holding it.
Put it down. You don't need to open it. I didn't open mine last time. I just listened to you.
Put the gun down, Jason. Put the gun down.
Step away from the envelope. Okay, so for the listeners, I never normally open envelopes like this, but for the drama of the sound, I'm going to open it like this.
With your penis?
See, it's a horrible way to open an envelope.
That is
All right.
terrible. All right.
I hope that was pleasing to you. I would never open an envelope like that, but...
Oh!
Okay.
All right.
C is for... fuck, of course it is. Shit.
Oh, did we get it wrong?
We were so spot on with the funky, and there's a distillery we left out that was a mistake to leave out.
Huh, okay.
There's also really good news on the way this didn't drink anything like its strength. Bottler. Single cask nation.
Son of a bitch. All right, now hold on. Let's do tasting notes before the brand reveal.
Okay, tasting
and
notes.
Are they his, or do they look like ours if it's a single cask nation bottling?
So this is Blind Barrel's take. Seabass, Christopher Sebastian writes, I had to do it. One of your own, and I know you guys enjoyed it this time around as much as you did when you picked the cask. This is a fun and one-of-a-kind pour for me, an introduction to the distillery. The rich earthiness, juxtaposed with the fruits found in their natural habitat, reminds me of walking through our office complex during citrus season and picking sun-baked citrus off the trees. And then he says in parentheses, yes, California is a sort of paradise. Close parentheses. Final sentence, it makes me feel like a warm summer day sitting in the dirt under a tree in a field.
Wow. Okay. Oh, I like those words. He's quite poetic, that Seabass.
I'll give you our truncated label note.
All right.
A study in contrasts. Effervescent yet unctuous, drying yet juicy, salty yet sweet. You're going to guess it from this sentence. Walk through a warm greenhouse, smell the fresh potting soil, and pull warm fruit from the vine, and you'll have an idea of what this dram has to offer. It's a lot of fun. You and I wrote that truncated tasting note in a hotel room in Kentucky at our last wild turkey selection.
I want to say it's the Ben Nevis 6-year-old.
That's exactly
There
what
you go.
is.
There you
Ben
go.
Nevis. We identified all the funk and we didn't go to Ben Nevis because we're idiots.
Wow. Look at that.
Yeah. Here's the notes that are on the sheet here. These might be ours. These might be Blind Barrels. I think these might be Blind Barrels, actually. Aroma notes: apple cider vinegar, pickled peaches, fresh squeezed warm lemon juice, fresh potting soil. Tasting notes: Meyer lemon, spicy sunshine, it's real, golden raisin, papaya with pepper, finish dried apple with white pepper, beautiful mouthfeel, oily and unctuous on the palate. So there you go.
Wow.
We didn't say Ben Nevis. We got and then the cask type on this.
It was a sherry Gorda, right? The label said sherry but it was a Gorda, right? So
and it was a Amontillado.
And it was a Amontillado, right? And what did I say about that old Pulteney Clipper from an Amontillado sherry cask that gave that kind of funkiness going on? And interesting that you from the outset, you shook it and you assumed the bubbles to be around 52%. Obviously, you were wrong, but
hugely.
But upon sipping it seemed like a low 50s ABV, but this was a mid 60s, wasn't it?
67.6. It doesn't. Well, it is interesting though. We did both say alcohol prickle on the nose.
Yes, we did. 100%.
A little bit of coughing in the first round of that, hitting the back of the throat, and yet doesn't drink like it. The bubbles don't represent it. Bubbles are nowhere near 67.6. That would be all bubbles in the shake test. All bubbles. It'd be making new bubbles.
Yeah, that's interesting. Oh, man. Imagine...
I'm always... Yeah.
Imagine if we tasted this and said, oof, this is terrible.
And that's what I was about to say to you is the takeaway from this is you and I said continually, boy, would I drink the shit out of this. I'm going to go look for a bottle when this reveal is made. Really happy with that. Really happy. I'm totally bummed that we got the funk and we didn't go as far as Ben Nevis Distillery. That was a mistake. We made a mistake there.
Well, we did. You are right. We 100% did because Ben Nevis does have a funk to it. I would say in our defense that the Amontillado cask changes the way the Ben Nevis funk normally presents itself.
But see, when you know what it is and you put your nose back in the glass,
then it's there.
Nevis.
It's all Ben Nevis all the time. Yeah.
The Amontillado has not changed it that much. All right. Thanks again to Christopher Sebastian, to Blind Barrels. Look them up, blindbarrels.com. Have some fun with your friends. Say stupid, embarrassing things. Miss distilleries that are patently obvious. I'm going to be thinking about this one for a while, Joshua. This one we missed a golden opportunity. You promised us
yes, I did.
an appreciation before we go. And unfortunately, I have to go. So,
yeah.
What's our appreciation? And then we got to get out of here.
Okay, so as a reminder to our listeners, we asked you to go to Apple Podcasts, give us a 5-star review, and write a little comment. And if you wrote a little comment, we would read it on the podcast. And here we are. And so, last time we read Cotton Ma's little thing here. Now we're going to read. Are you ready for this? The person's name is Zipper Blues 82286. Are there 82,286 people who also chose 285 people who also chose Zipper Blues, and that was the first one?
That's weeks of entering in a username to try and get approval. That's a lot.
All right.
Or are we looking at a zip code?
Oh, that's interesting. All right, little investigation. Anyway, the headline is Insightful Insider Pad Cost. 5 stars.
Ooh, well played. Well played.
This is far and away the best whiskey pad cost out there. As industry insiders, J&J know the right questions to ask their guests and have a great rapport with them. Not only is it entertaining, but is very nerdy. This podcast lingers over the details and technicalities. If you want to hear about yeast and fermentation times and copper contact, it's all here. The only way this podcast could be better is if they completed the Worm Tub episode.
I think that comment is so perfect for today's episode. It's all the things we've talked about, leading into the episode, leading into the interview, coming out of the interview. Like that's the details are where it's at, and I'm really glad that. Was it Zipper Blues?
Zipper Blues 82-286.
I'm glad that they really get us, and I worry that if we ever complete and post the Worm Tub episode, I feel that we're going to lose 99% of our following.
Oh, because they'll feel as if it's been completed. Like
that'll be it.
That's a close. That's an end scene.
You'll know it's the last episode of One Nation Under Whiskey when we proudly announce that it's the Worm Tub episode.
Oh my gosh. I think that's what we do at year 10. Whenever we decide we're done with this podcast.
See, you named it year.
I know, Jason. This is my failing. This is my failing. Hashtag this is my failing.
For everyone who's waited for the Worm Tub episode, congratulations, you have ended a podcast. That's great. I love hearing that. I perhaps wrongly assume, was that 5 stars, did you say?
It was 5 stars.
Very kind. Thank you. Thank you ever so much. I say it all the time. I love that we have a following. I love that we've got inside jokes. I love that we can meet people along the way who can share those inside jokes with us. It's brilliant. I absolutely love it all. And so thanks ever so much. Zipper Blue and then 5 digits.
82286.
I love that you've got it committed.
I had to push some old stuff out just to make that happen. All right, Jason, to Brett and Orlin, for their time. We thank them greatly. To Elijah for getting us the samples for that tasting. That was wonderful. And I keep on saying to this person, to that person, they can't see it. I've raised my glass. I'm holding my glass up. I'm raising my glass to them. To you, Jason, and to our listeners, I say 2 chins and peace.
Peace.